Okay, Philip, I suggest we start um, and let's see how the link will work. Yeah, you ready?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Okay. Thank you and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to host this session. My name is Nadia Gurashvili. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Democratic Security Institute. It is an independent, non-partisan think tank which is based in Estonia, and we work on democracy to bring security, social justice, prosperity to the people living in the countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. DSI runs the Eurasia Democratic Security Network Fellowship Program, which is funded generously by National Endowment for Democracy. It's a network of prominent scholars, practitioners, policy professionals who are sharing the interest in the democratic security in Eurasian region. And at this session, we are happy to host our fellow, Philip Obaji, who will be leading the session, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation. Philip, as I mentioned, is a EDSN fellow and a prominent Nigerian journalist. He will share his investigation and findings about grave violations and abuses by Russian paramilitaries in the Central and West Africa, which he has been investigating since 2018. Philip has dedicated his work to exposing foreign interference and human rights abuses in Africa. He is a recipient of 2025 Knight International Journalism Award, also 2025 Homo Homini Human Rights Award, and 2023 One World Media International Journalist of the Year Award. Philip has been reporting for Al Jazeera, Daily Beast, Guardian, USA Today, among other outlets. And he will be with us for next 30, 45 minutes to tell us a little bit about the developments in Africa, about his work, his research, and what it means to be a journalist in a very difficult context. Welcome, Philip, and we are very happy to have you with us. As a format, I would like to just explain that this will be like a Q&A session. I have prepared a few questions for Philip, but we are also very happy to take questions from our participants and audience. But let me start with the first question, Philip. So please help us understand the context. What is Russia doing in Africa and how it is engaging, and what are its priorities there? You
First of
have
all, thank
around
you.
you have around 10 minutes for each question.
Okay, thank you so much, Media. Well, since 2015, Russia has signed various military agreements, in fact, with 43 African nations, and they're offering mercenary support, weapon sales, and training to regimes fighting insurgency, and often filling vacuums left by retreating Western forces, especially France. So you have Russia signing agreements with multiple African nations, 43 of them. But if you look deeply, you have Russian involvement in quite a number of countries that go deeper than just signing military contracts. You have private military companies, especially the Wagner Group, involved in quite a number of countries. Now, Wagner were involved in Libya. They're still pretty much involved in Libya, but since 2017, they've had mercenaries in Libya helping General Haftar forces fight against the UN-backed government. If you know Libya very well, you find that Libya has two governments currently, one in Tripoli, the capital, which is where you have the UN-backed government, and then the other in Benghazi, where General Haftar's forces are in control. And the Wagner PMC was involved in Sudan. So in 2018, they were invited by then President Umar al-Bashir when he was losing grip on power. So Wagner's role was to help him hold on to power. Unfortunately, the people ousted al-Bashir, the military ousted al-Bashir, and they took power. And much later, we saw Wagner being involved in the Libyan civil war that began in 2023. So we saw the rapid support paramilitaries fighting against the Libyan armed forces, and the Russians have been involved either ways. So we saw a situation where the Wagner group were providing weapons to the RSF, and then later on also started to get involved with the Sudanese armed forces. So that's been the involvement in Sudan, and we've seen lots of disinformation inside Sudan as well. Well, that's not all. The Wagner group were involved in Mozambique, and at the time Mozambique were fighting against so-called Islamic State West African province militias. And then President Felipe Nyusi invited the Wagner group to help fight against these militants. This was around 2019, 2020. And the Russians have been involved in the Central African Republic since 2018. In fact, this is their most notable involvement in Africa. And in that year, then president, or current president, in fact, Francine Ashanti Touadera, invited the Wagner group to help fight against militiamen that were almost on the verge of overriding the capital. Well, the Central African Republic has been in a civil war which began in 2013. And when the war began in 2013, not long after, the UN Security Council imposed an arms embargo on the country. So when President Touadera took office in 2016, only the capital, Bangui, was under government control. The rest of the country were in the hands of either Muslim rebels or Christian militias. So when he took office, he knew that he needed help externally. And while Western nations were not willing to get involved, Touadera approached Russia, and Vladimir Putin agreed to support the country in two ways. First, he agreed that he was going to get the UN Security Council to lift the arms embargo. And then secondly, he agreed that he was going to send Russian soldiers to the Central African Republic to be able to fight against these rebels and militiamen. In exchange for Russia having access to the mineral resources of the country. This is a country that's rich in gold and diamonds. The problem was that virtually all the over 100 gold mines in the country were in areas controlled by these militiamen. So when the Russians got involved in 2018, the only way they were going to be able to access this gold and diamond resources was to fight against the militiamen that were already in control of these mines. Well, and that's what they've been doing since then. But we've seen lots of reports of human rights abuses, massacres and what have you. Now, since 2022 or thereabout, the Russians have been involved in Mali, helping government forces fight against jihadists that operate in the northern part of the country. And also they've been involved in fighting of secessionists who are interested in getting independence for a region in northern Mali called Azawad. So they've been involved there. And we've seen so-called Russian military instructors sent to Burkina Faso, in recent months. And in Mali, we have a number of Russian military instructors who are present in the country. Well, in terms of other activities, like I did say, Russia is interested in extraction of resources from Africa by passing sanctions that has been imposed by the EU and the US. And they've also been involved in disinformation that is spreading like wildfire across the continent. And from West Africa to Central Africa, we have seen massive Russian disinformation where Russian trolls have used social media to spread false narratives about democracies in Africa. They've used the same avenue to spread false narratives about Europe and about the US. So generally what the Russians want to achieve is to see democracy crumble in many parts of the continent, is to help promote the agenda of promoting Russian culture across the continent, and also to encourage Africans who are willing to travel up north into Europe. So the disinformation campaign works in multiple folds, targeting democracies because Russia would rather work with military governments than with democratically elected leaders. And the idea that disinformation can help create a migration crisis in Europe appeals to Russia, and that's why in areas in West Africa you hear a lot of information on local radio and TV where pro-Russian commentators are urging Africans to travel to Europe. So basically, the Russians have worked in these two areas as far as their involvement in Africa is concerned. Well, they also help in terms of legitimacy, they're helping a number of African countries to pursue nuclear power deals. But in terms of, the corny nature of the Russian state, the vast majority of its operations in Africa involves the use of mercenaries in certain countries and the disinformation campaign that is spreading like wildfire across the continent. Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. So it looks like quite a difficult context to work in. So can you share how do you do the research in this kind of difficult circumstances, and what it means to be a journalist in this context? You visit quite risky and dangerous areas. You have to communicate with these mercenaries, right? So how do you deal with this situation, and how do you still continue to do your work?
Well, it's been very, very difficult. It's not an easy job to do, and especially working in areas that are very, very insecure. So I have had to go through a lot of difficulty in give me a minute. Okay. Just a minute. So can you see this?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to just in the course of speaking, just share, something about how I was able to begin this and the difficulty involved. Now you can see these three Russian journalists who have. Can you see can you see my screen?
Yeah. We see
Okay.
it's not a slideshow, but we see the presentation.
Yeah. Okay. So now, these three Russian journalists were the people who I would say, inspired my work in the Central African Republic. Kirill Radchenko, Alexander Rastugiev, and Okan Jamel. Now, in 2018, they traveled to the Central African Republic to investigate the operations of the Russian Wagner Group. Now, at the time, not many people knew about this group. Now, these three journalists were part of work by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's richest man, and they were on the verge of understanding exactly what the Russians were doing in the country. So when they traveled to Bangui, they went to the main office of the Wagner Group, the Wagner base in Bangui, and they tried to speak to a couple of Wagner paramilitaries, but they were not allowed access to. And after their ordeal in Bangui, they decided to travel north to see how Wagner paramilitaries have been deployed across the country. Unfortunately for them, they were killed in a town called Sibut. Now, my editor at the time, the late Christopher Dickey, reached out to me and asked if I could find out exactly what these journalists were up to in the Central African Republic. And he also asked the Daily Beast Russia correspondent Anna Nemtsova, who was very close to these journalists, to report on their life. And he wanted her to speak to their families, and then so people can get to know exactly who these journalists were. So we both did that. I called a lot of my contacts in the country, And myself and Anna came up with one of the most read articles on the Daily Beast site for that year. Now, in the course of finding out exactly what happened to these guys, I had a lot of stories now about the Wagner Group. Now, interviewing people made me realize that the Wagner Group was up to something very huge. They were up to, exploring and exploiting the resources of the Central African Republic. So that was how it began. That's how my investigation into the Wagner Group began. Now, in the years that followed, I came up with quite a number of stories, investigations about Russia. As you can see on the screen, how Putin's private army, as we call the Wagner Group, massacred people in Koki, how witnesses uncovered, mass murder that, targeted Chinese miners in the country. Spoke about abduction of teens by Russian paramilitaries. I also reported about how, someone was sold on Facebook by a Russian paramilitary. And there's quite a lot of reporting, since 2018 up till date that I have done as far as, the Russian paramilitaries are concerned. So it wasn't an easy job. And you can see Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner Group. Now, the reason I put him up is because I've had an encounter with him a couple of years back in 2022, just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I heard from my contacts in the Wagner Group that Russia had pulled about 200 mercenaries from Africa. And these mercenaries were not Russians or Belarusians. They were Africans who fought for the rebel group called the Union for Peace. Now, the Union for Peace is a rebel group that's active in the northern part of the country, and they're fighting against the Wagner Group. Now, they've had a lot of difficulty in doing their job because Wagner, with much better equipment and what have you, have been targeting this group. So in 2022, the Wagner Group offered amnesty to any militant who was willing to lay down their arms and then join the ranks of the Wagner Group. And so quite a number of them, hundreds of them, decided to lay down arms and join the Wagner Group. So before the full-scale invasion in February of 22, Russia had pulled 200 of these members of this UPC group and flown to Moscow on training. Now, a couple of them reached out to me and said, look, 200 of our compatriots, of our colleagues have been flown to Moscow, and about 100 of them will be sent to Ukraine's Donbas region to fight. And so I picked up my phone and I messaged Yevgeny Prigozhin. And I asked, I'd like you to confirm what I'm hearing because I'm going to publish very soon. So Prigozhin did not respond. So usually he was very good at responding to Daily Beast journalists. I mean, a number of my colleagues were very happy to always be in touch with him, but he had never responded to any of my messages, never. And I could understand the reason he was that way was because I had spent many months investigating the Wagner Group, reporting on various atrocities by Wagner. But in the days that followed, I got a phone call from a number that was hidden, and I'm not sure till date whether or not it was Prigozhin, but it sounded like Prigozhin. And the person asking me if I wanted to die. That was it. So I got a phone call, and then the person on the phone was like, hello, Philip, you are troubling us. You are asking too many questions. You sent a message to Mr. Prigozhin. Do you want to die? I got scared and I hung up. And then moments after, the number called again with the same question, do you want to die? And then I hung up again. And then the third time, the number called again, and I said, look, I said to the person, do your worst. I'm not afraid of you. And then the person now hung up. But afterwards, I began to face massive amount of disinformation targeting me on social media. I received a lot of calls, threats, and what have you, people from all walks of life. But mostly people who I knew were Russians. So this is what I faced in the Central African Republic when I went to the country in 2015. In 2023, after the death of Prigozhin, nobody was sure exactly what will be of the Wagner Group following Prigozhin's death. So I decided on my own to travel to the Central African Republic, which is the one country where they had massive amount of Russian paramilitaries. So if you want to know much about the Wagner Group, travel to the Central African Republic. So I went there, 2023 in December. I drove in my friend's car from Nigeria to Cameroon. It wasn't an easy journey because in Western Cameroon, there is a war. There is a war in Western Cameroon, and the English speakers are fighting for independence. So the government forces are fighting against these separatists to gain control of the country. And for some reason, the rebels usually allow Catholic priests to pass freely, from the Nigerian border, from Nigeria to Cameroon. So now I told a friend of mine, a Catholic priest, that I need to travel into Cameroon. So he said, okay, well, the only way you can travel is if we dress you up as a Catholic priest so that the rebels will not have any problems with you. So that's how I dressed in a Catholic Roman collar and a soutane. I was able to drive across the border from Nigeria to Cameroon. And when I got into Cameroon, I got another car that I hired that took me from Douala straight across the border into the Central African Republic. Now, I couldn't fly to Bangui because I had been told by my contacts in the Wagner group that my name and my photograph had been shared in WhatsApp, groups, in the WhatsApp group of the Wagner group. And when my photo was shared, there was an instruction by the commander of the Wagner group that anyone who sees me should either get me killed or arrest me. So that's why I couldn't fly to Bangui, so I had to go by road. So when I got there, I spent the night in the guest house. I got to Beloko, a border town with Cameroon. So I spent the night in the guest house, and the following day, I got on a motorcycle that took me to the border with Cameroon because I was hoping to interview miners who were fleeing Russian aggression into Cameroon. So once I got to the border, a pickup vehicle just drove and pulled over. And then I had just come down the motorcycle because I rode on the commercial motorcycle to the border, and I just come down from the motorcycle and was reaching out for my phone and camera when this, I'm sorry, I'm talking a little longer than 10 minutes, when this pickup van pulled over. And there were 4 Central African soldiers in the pickup van. So they came out of the vehicle and then they all rushed me. And they rushed me, started to beat me with their baton, whip, and what have you. And I fell on the ground. I managed to look up. When I looked up, I saw 2 Russian paramilitaries who were ordering the soldiers to manhandle me. And eventually they took me and then detained me in a small shipping container just by the border. I was there overnight. It was a very poor place. And then what saved me was the fact that the motorcyclist who took me to the border had seen what happened. And so the following morning, he ran to a friend of his who was a senior officer in the Central African Armed Forces. So it was this friend of his that came to the place where I was detained and pleaded with the soldiers to release me. Luckily for me, the Russians were not there that morning, it was just the Central African Armed Forces. So that's how I got released. And then I traveled into Cameroon, and then I sought treatment, and then I returned back to the Central African Republic a few days after to continue my investigation. So I came up with this story, how a young girl was raped in a military base, another one raped in a military base. So you can see these photographs of people, of young girls raped by Russian paramilitaries. This one was raped on her farm, on her farm, and what have you. So that has been the situation. Yeah.
Okay. Wow, this
Um,
really sounds horrifying, I have to say.
indeed, indeed.
Um, and just to go back to the Wagner Group. So how do they operate basically there, and what happened after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and particularly after the death of the founder of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin, right? Have there been any changes, any improvements, possibly?
Well, this is how they operate in the areas where they are present. and currently they are present in the Central African Republic and in Mali. So the Russians just sent a battalion of mercenaries to these countries, both the CAR and Mali. And so what these guys do is that when they get into these countries, they first of all land in the capital. If it's in the Central African Republic, they land in Bangui, and they spend some time in Bangui, and after which they're deployed to the areas where you have gold mines. So now, the reason the Russians are in this country is because they feel it is important for the Russian economy if Russia can extract these resources and then sell in the black market to be able to raise monies for Putin's war in Ukraine. Now we have seen hundreds of mercenaries being deployed to these mining communities, and when they get to these communities, they do not in any way pre-inform people that they're coming. And when they get there, they make no distinction between the civilians and the militiamen that they're fighting against. So because they feel that everyone living in these communities are allied to the militiamen, so they begin to open fire at people. That's why you see hundreds of people dying in communities where gold mining takes place. So that has been the norm. So you see the Russians appear, target people, civilians, target young girls whom they rape, whom they torture. And oftentimes you see a situation where a massacre takes place, and to cover up this massacre, the young people in those communities are made to bury the dead people in mass graves. So that's been the mode of operation in the Central African Republic. It's similar to what they do in Mali. So in Mali, they're fighting against jihadis and against Tuareg separatists in the northern part of the country. So now there has been sort of an ethnic cleansing in parts of Mali. If people remember what is being known as the Mora massacre in 2022, where Mora, a community that is made up of predominantly ethnic Fulani people. Now, the Russians attacked this community simply because they felt that everyone in that community was working with jihadists that are of Fulani origin. So it is one of the most gruesome acts by Russian paramilitaries anywhere in Africa. After the attacks in March of this year, of 2022, about 500 people, or more than 500 people, were killed by the Russians. And there were mass reports of rape, of civilians being buried in mass graves, people being tortured in very bad ways. So that has been how they have operated in these areas. And as we speak, they're still very much involved in the Central African Republic and in Mali. You had a follow-up question, Media. What was it? I don't remember.
Now, whether anything has changed since the death of the Prigozhin.
Prigozhin. Well, nothing much has changed. What has changed is the fact that rather than report to a civilian, as the Wagner group operated under Prigozhin, where Prigozhin was the man who oversaw the operations of the Wagner group, whether it was in Africa or whether it was in Syria or in Ukraine. Now you have the Russian Ministry of Defense supervising the operations of the Wagner group. And they have changed the name from the Wagner group to the Africa Corps. So Wagner in practice does no longer exist in practice, but in the way at which the mercenaries operate, we haven't seen any difference. Matter of fact, the people who actually commanded the Wagner group, especially in the Central African Republic, are pretty much the same people who are doing the same job right now, even under the supervision of the Russian MOD. A typical example is a man called Dmitry Siti. So Siti was like the operational head of the Russian Wagner mercenaries at the time Prigozhin, ran the group. But Siti is still very much there in the country doing the same job and even having more responsibility because he's the man very much in charge of the Russian Culture House, whose responsibility is to promote Russian culture in the Central African Republic. In Mali, we've seen and even read, online how multiple Russian paramilitaries were killed a couple of years ago by jihadis and Azawad separatists. And a lot of these victims were people who worked with Prigozhin under the Wagner group. And when the group metamorphosized to the African Corps, they continued to do the same job in Mali. And a lot of them who worked with Prigozhin are still very much, around these days. So yeah, nothing much has changed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. You've already talked a little bit about the violations that you have seen, and I understand that they are really grave violations and um, not easy to talk about. But you've been investigating and you've been talking to victims and you've been reporting their stories. So I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit about those violations you have encountered, and particularly, my understanding is that because victims talk to you as a journalist, this means they want to have their voice heard. So, what is it that they really want to share, and what is it that victims and communities, affected communities, are demanding when they are talking to you?
Well, I've heard a lot of stories, very difficult ones. Sometimes it breaks me down. And the truth is, people in these communities have faced multiple torture, whether it's emotional, whether it's mental, whether it's physical, and they want assistance, they need help. And as difficult as it is to speak about their plight and the ordeal, many of them are still brave enough to talk about what they've been through. And the reason they do so is so that the world can hear their stories, so that they can get the support that they so desire. And sadly, much of the support that they need, has been difficult to come by. But I have spoken to dozens of victims in the Central African Republic and in Mali, particularly in the Central African Republic, which is where I have focused a lot more on. And many victims, especially the women, have talked about how they were lured into, military camps by Russian paramilitaries and raped. And not just that, some of them were administered contraceptives because the Russians did not want a situation where they get pregnant and then give birth to half-caste babies. So they had to face the trauma of being forced by these Russian paramilitaries who raped them, and the torture of being administered injections that they did not ask for. And there have been a couple of them who got pregnant and they were forced into an abortion by Russian paramilitaries. And I've also spoken to victims of human trafficking. Cameroonians were trafficked from their homes and they ended up in the Central African Republic where they were raped and impregnated by Russian paramilitaries. And after which these men had their babies aborted. Now, there have also been boys who've been raped in mining sites by Wagner paramilitaries. And they have also spoken of the mental and emotional torture that they've been subjected to as a result of this rape. And I have spoken to young people who have worked in mining areas that are controlled by the Russians, and they've spoken a lot about how they were tortured, made to work nonstop for many hours, fed just once a day, and being forced to work under very inhumane conditions. And it's been very difficult hearing these stories. So why they speak is they want justice. Many of them want justice, but they also do not want to see this aggression and this torture continue, because sometimes a victim faces torture and days after he saw a brother or sister or family member becomes a victim as well. So they don't want to see the expansion of this Russian aggression that they are facing. So it's the reason why they speak to me. And I tell you what, a lot of them will speak to me, speak in tears. I can't remember ever doing an interview with a victim in Central Africa or in Mali without this person shedding tears. So it's always very difficult, very tough to even speak about these abuses. Yeah, but they want justice. They also want help, psychosocial support for their families to start new businesses, but also they want peace, security, and freedom, which has been lacking since the Russians got involved in their communities.
And has there been any discussions about the accountability and criminal responsibility of these Wagner groups members who have been committing crimes? Are there like human rights groups talking about this? Are there different agencies, institutions talking about the accountability and criminal responsibility of Wagner and its members?
Well, one of the biggest concerns, biggest issues is that it is Russia. So it always seems like there's little you can do except condemn this act. So wherever the Russians are, the best people can do is condemn. So you cannot target them, whether it's with force or militarily or what have you. So you don't, get into any confrontation with the Russian state. I mean, we've seen exactly what this has happened since the war in Ukraine started. Russia has only faced sanctions, and even when NATO members have tried to offer weapons to Ukraine, there's always this caveat that you cannot fire these weapons into Russian territory. I mean, it was there for a long time. A number of countries were reluctant to send long-range weapons to Ukraine because they didn't want a situation where they fire these weapons, into Russian territory. So the best that we have seen is the talk about, what Russia has done is bad. There's always condemnation for the atrocities, that these Russian paramilitaries have done in Africa. But that's where it ends. I mean, no one is able to hold them to account. I mean, no one can even engage them in any way because people fear that there could be retribution, or people see it as a direct confrontation with the Kremlin and what have you. So, and the other sad part is that the regimes in these countries are the ones who have invited these Russians. So the Russians enjoy the cover that they get from the regime. So what's going to hold them to account when the leadership of these countries are the ones who say come in the first place? Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, I would like to also ask our participants to either raise a hand to ask the question or write in the chat as they wish before we wrap up the session. But my last question would be about your plans. Do you plan to continue the investigation? I know you are now preparing an article on the recent findings. But yeah, tell us about your plans and your work, your future work.
It's very difficult to stop media because I've reached a point in life where I'm happy that many people are interested in listening to what I know and what I report about. And also, the people that I write about are very interested in telling their stories as much as possible. I mean, every now and then, I get to hear from more and more victims in Western Central Africa. So I feel that my responsibility, which is to tell the stories, must continue. And I also cannot help but continue to travel around the world to report on my investigations, my findings. And I'm very encouraged at the number of people who are interested in what Russia is doing in Africa. I'm still not satisfied with, the results that we have gotten. I mean, in terms of how Russia is made to pay for its crimes and how Russia is being stopped from expanding its operations. That we're still a long way away from having results in that regard. But at least more people are interested in listening. I think Europe as a continent and the EU as a body has a lot of work to do. I don't think they're doing to my satisfaction. And they are one of the groups that I have been targeting a lot. That's why I spend much of my time these days in Europe trying to get the message across to the EU. So if I stop, if I keep quiet, then it's likely that I will be enabling more Russian success, so to speak, in Africa, because we're in a situation where democracies in West Africa are falling. We have 4 countries in West Africa that are currently under military dictatorship. 3 of these countries are so strongly allied to Russia. And in Nigeria, there was an attempt to topple the government of President Bola Tinubu last year. That attempt failed. And it's still not clear if at all there's a Russian connection. But whether or not there's a Russian connection to that coup attempt, the fact that the Russians have supported coups in parts of Africa, that also tells that they could also do same elsewhere. So me stopping will be like me allowing some bit of leverage or some opportunities for the Russians to expand its operations. So I want more people to even join me in this course, because I mean, I know that there are many journalists who are trying so hard to uncover what they have found, especially as regards Russian aggression and Russian disinformation. But I want to see more effort. I want to also see more support for African journalists and the media in Africa in terms of uncovering these Russian crimes. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe final question from my side. So you've traveled to Europe. Do you think so there is this interest to engage on this issue, to take up this issue? What was your stance when you were having meetings there?
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, I started to travel across the world in 2024. But I have, since last year, I've done, since December 24, I have done a lot of these travels to Europe. In the beginning, the interest was almost not there. But now that they've come to realize that Africa is always the go-to continent, for Russia when it comes to manpower. I mean, we're seeing dozens, hundreds of Africans being recruited by Russia to fight in Ukraine. We're seeing how Russia is targeting democracies in Europe with massive disinformation using trolls that are based in Africa. So Europe is seeing that now. And Europe is also seeing that the number of Africans who are seeking to cross the Mediterranean Sea into Italy and Greece is increasing. And they know that Russian operations in Europe or targeting Europe usually stems from Africa. So now the interest is growing. And as a journalist who has spent time investigating these operations, finding exactly how Russia does its operations and how Africa is the ground for this, I really have been able to convince quite a number of people that this fight against Russian aggression, Russian imperialism, Russian hybrid war has to be fought beginning from Africa. So now I'm getting a lot of people pay attention to these Russian operations. But there's still a long way to go. Still a long, long way to go. I mean, there's so much of division in European politics. Far right, politics is growing so much in Europe, and a lot of these far right groups and political interests still have alliances with Russia, which makes it very difficult, to get a message across and get efforts that will bring results. I mean, I've spoken to parliamentarians in Austria, which is one of the most difficult places to even spread, any kind of information about Russia and then get massive overwhelming support, because you also have, the growth of far-right political movement. But I was able to at least speak to, some moderate politicians about these efforts, and I got a lot of promises and interest. Yeah, I've been to Amsterdam, to Berlin, to Geneva, where I've gone a couple of times in recent months. And I'm seeing interest grow, but very slowly. And there's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And actually, I will use this opportunity to make a small announcement about your fundraising efforts.
That's
Maybe that
correct.
because I mean the work you do is really very important, very impressive, and I really think that needs to be supported. And Philip is fundraising a little bit to get financial support to continue to uncover Russian atrocities in Africa. So if you go to GoFundMe and you just type Philip Obaji uncover Russian atrocities in Africa, you will get to his page where you can donate a little bit and help him basically continue his investigation and his research. Thank you very much, Philip. It was really very interesting, but at the same time quite heartbreaking, to hear all the all the awful violations that Wagner Group is committing in Africa, and unfortunately there is no accountability for that. I will ask our participants if they want to ask any questions. Please raise your hand. I think this is really very interesting topic, quite a new topic as well. Although we've heard about Wagner, I have to say that we've heard about Wagner mostly in the context of Ukraine, after the invasion of Ukraine. But yeah, I think it seems to be quite difficult in Africa. Yeah, if there are no questions, I think that we can wrap up here, and I hope that with this session we also contribute to the increased public awareness of the crimes and violations that are committed in Central African Republic or in Mali by Wagner Group. And I do think that the story that you are preparing and the research you're doing deserves to be widely publicized, and the stories of victims need to be heard widely, so that maybe at some point in near future they'll be able to get justice and the remedy for the violations and for the violations that they have experienced. So
thank you so much.
with this, I would also like to thank you once again, Philip, for your work and for joining us and for sharing your work and your findings. And we are very much looking forward to see the final publication and final version of your article, and we'll be happy to republish on our webpage as well. And it's an honor for us to have you as our fellow as well.
Thank you, Medea. I really appreciate
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who was able to join. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.